All right. Hey, everybody out there. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Brandon Del Pozo. I am a research fellow with the Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association. I'm also a postdoctoral research fellow at Brown University and the Miriam Hospital in Rhode Island, where I do drug policy research. But I come to that role from 23 years in policing, 19 years as a New York City police officer, and 4 as the chief of police in Burlington, Vermont. That's one of the reasons why I was asked to help moderate this panel on de-escalation, where we're going to hear about the research on that topic from 2 very interesting presenters today. We'll have the opportunity to engage in some question and answer. We'll have the opportunity to probe these topics a little more deeply, but it's an exciting and very timely topic in policing. So it's an honor to be able to moderate this and to introduce these 2 scholars. I'll give you an intro to both. Then Dr. Cramondine will start, and then Ms. DeVoe will do the presentation second. So today we have, again, 2 papers on de-escalation. One by Dr. Yasmin Cramondine. She's an adjunct professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Alberta and the Director of Research and Development at protraining.com. So she graduated with a PhD in psychiatry, and she's made it, and this is her quoting, her life's mission to create practical training to make police interactions with the public safe. She delivers the only evidence-based de-escalation training in the world through protraining.com. I may have a question for her about that. Based on 10 years of scientific research, her training continues to be delivered to police officers, university security, bus operators, paramedics, housing employees, and government agencies across Canada, the USA, and the Netherlands. Lisa DeVoe, for her part, has been a constable in the Ottawa Police for 5 years. What makes her, a very interesting constable, she's also a registered social worker. She's a practitioner, and I just found out in the pre-panel chat that she took a leave of absence from her work on patrol to gain more frontline experience as a practicing social worker, in her field. She discovered that law enforcement agencies within Ontario were given immense discretion when training police officers on mental health and crisis intervention. And she realized that there's this tremendous amount of autonomy that's coupled with the need to understand the use of force, need to understand de-escalation. And she was hoping to bring a more systematic and methodical approach to de-escalation. So she found that agencies are mandated to train officers on the use of force, but oftentimes it's at the expense of good de-escalation training. It's at the expense of crisis intervention. It's at the expense of conflict resolution as mandated by the police service manual. She's trying to reconcile these tensions. We'll hear her give a talk about ways to conduct this training without it being at the expense of these other skills and to do so more holistically. So that's what we're in store for the next 46 minutes. So we'll go and start with Dr. Cramondine, and I'd like to welcome her and then take it away, Dr. Cramondine.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brendan. So I just shared my screen. You should be able to see it.
I can see it.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so I have 3 screens going here. So all the chat's over here. So I'm constantly going to be observing the chat. If you have any questions along the way, I'm more than happy to answer them. So I'm very excited to be here today, partly because LEPH, it is my absolute favorite conference to attend. This one's actually my 5th. So I've been very lucky in being able to attend it. And secondly, because as I mentioned previously in the beginning of this chat, if you were here, I am 39 weeks pregnant. So I was extremely hoping that I did not go into labor yet, and I haven't. So this is good news, and I am here, and let's get started. So as Brendan mentioned, I am Yasmin Cramondine. I'm a researcher in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Alberta, and I did graduate with a PhD in psychiatry, and I've just been developing in-person and online de-escalation and mental health training for police since 2011, and I deliver this training through a company called ProTraining. So today I will give some background on de-escalation. I'm going to talk about what it is and where it fits. And then I want to talk about the training itself, what I've created, the research behind it, and also the evidence-informed components that are kind of important to be included in the training. And if all other speakers could mute their mics, that would be awesome. Thank you. Okay, so not only do I believe in evidence-based and informed training, but I believe in evidence-informed delivery. And what better way to make a session fun and engaging than to add some audience participation? So let's begin by seeing where our audience members are from today. So if you could just type in the chat box, making sure that the chat goes to panelists and attendees, just so everyone can see your responses. That'd be great, so we can see where you're from. I am from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and I am extremely grateful to be presenting at a very decent hour. It is 11:07 in the morning, so it's very exciting for me. Okay, let's see, we have, oh, wonderful. Victor from the Netherlands, welcome, Victor. Jennifer from Toronto, Ken from Ottawa, Kristen from Massachusetts, Crystal from Whitby, Ontario, Inga from Scotland, welcome, Inga. Elliot from Nashville, Joseph from St. Louis, sorry. Isaac from New York City. Okay, wonderful. Colorado, Edmonton, welcome. Justine from Newmarket, Denver, LA, wonderful. Thank you for chatting. And it's always nice to see where people are joining us from in the world. That's what's great about these conferences, is you can really attend from anywhere. And then just another quick question for the group, like, who do we have in our audience today? What areas do you work in? I would imagine that it would be a very diverse group and a diverse audience, which is, again, one of the reasons why LEPH is my favorite, just because this conference brings together diverse backgrounds and experiences, which definitely makes for amazing conversations and collaboration. Okay, so we have a physician, a sheriff, researcher, wonderful. So all the different areas already, which is so great to see. Law enforcement, surgeon. Oh, Ken, are you questioning your job? I'm just kidding. Joseph is a researcher, public health. Okay, student. Wonderful. So lots of different groups here today. Well, thank you for joining us, everybody. I really appreciate it. All right, now let's jump in. So the first thing I wanted to address was de-escalation itself. Like, what is de-escalation? What does it mean? So de-escalation is defined as using specific techniques to decrease or prevent the escalation of conflict. So these specific techniques kind of relate to when an officer interacts with the public. And specifically, as you can read on the screen, it includes preventative and non-escalation techniques. So these are things that you could do kind of before an interaction to decrease tension, or even what to kind of keep in mind throughout an interaction to not escalate the person you are speaking with. It also includes specific verbal communication skills, so certain words that can help you in your interactions, specific nonverbal communication skills, so how we use our body language, how we move, how we hold ourselves. It also includes empathy, so using skills to not only like help you to understand another's point of view, but also to like better communicate to somebody that, you know what, you hear them and you see them and you are there to help. And finally, the use of the environment to our advantage, and also providing those additional supports to make sure that instances don't repeat. So that's the basis of de-escalation in a nutshell. And I also wanted to chat a bit about where does de-escalation fit. So before I get a bit into the evidence behind effective de-escalation training, I really want to emphasize how important it is to keep in mind that, like, de-escalation training, it is not the magic bullet to kind of prevent use of force occurrences and fatal encounters. It's one piece to a very large puzzle, and it takes collaboration and partnerships and just continuous focus and improvement. And I just bring this up because oftentimes de-escalation, or any other training for that matter, it's really viewed as this magic bullet, or that one thing that will fix fatal shootings, or it will fix racism, or it'll fix mental health crisis response. And the quick fix is oftentimes placed on, I would say, police organizational shoulders. But I would like to say that there are many pieces to this puzzle. Solutions are extremely complicated. They take time. And I do believe that there are three pillars that do exist in preventing fatal encounters. And I'm just going to speak on this just for a moment. And they include the collaboration between policing, public health, and the public. So firstly, policing, as I mentioned, is one piece of the solution. And first, as I know and love, we need to support our officers with the de-escalation training that they deserve. So studies show that the primary reason that recruits join the police service is to help others and to help the community. And to support them in their role, we need to make sure that they have the adequate resources and the adequate funding to train their officers in softer skills like de-escalation, just so that in times of fear and stress, their de-escalation skills become reflexive. De-escalation skills, It must be at the forefront of their minds for them to be able to use them. Secondly, police organizations need to focus on building trust through listening and community engagement. And as humans, we are all problem solvers. We usually jump straight to trying to fix the problem without really knowing what the problem is. So the issue with that is that, like, while everyone is trying to fix the problem, we might forget to listen. And listening is really the most important part of de-escalation itself. It shows empathy, it shows support, and it says, as I mentioned previously, that, like, you know what, I'm here, I hear you, and I'm on your side and on your team and wanting to make this better. And it's not a one-time thing, it needs to be constant, which can be done through that community engagement piece. And finally, with policing, there needs to bring forward the accountability of peers. So police brutality and racism we know is wrong, and police need to hold their peers accountable when they see them inciting violence or hatred. So again, that's one piece, is policing. The second piece I would say is public health, which is another part of the solution, and this includes mental health. So first, we need adequate funding for early intervention. We need prevention of mental health crisis and continued treatment and follow-up care for individuals in crisis. So mental health, we all know, is complicated. There's no easy remedy. Additionally, we can make better use of existing resources. Police officers attending hospitals with mental health patients, they wait on average 4 to 12 hours to see a doctor in the emergency room. And this creates lots of overtime costs. So we need to think of all the areas where we can work to make things more efficient, asking those hard questions around kind of how police and public health can form these partnerships and work together. And finally, there needs to be alternatives to police involvement. So there are many examples that you will hear about throughout this entire conference. For example, those mobile mental health teams where you have a police officer and a nurse working together to attend mental health calls, or alternative safe spaces where an officer can drop off an individual to kind of get the help and support that they need. So this is, I would say, is the second pillar to solving this issue, the public health. And then the third pillar I would say is the public. So there are things that every person can do. You don't need to be a part of policing or public health. The third pillar is the public. And the first thing the public we need to do is we need to support each other. People, I would say, naturally get angry when they see something that goes against their values. And it's definitely okay to be angry and stand up for one another in, I guess I would say, the societal fight against racism and discrimination and supports for mental health. But also reaching out to others and also letting them know that, you know what, you hear them, and giving them this safe space where they could tell you how they feel. Secondly, if you're part of the public, what we could do is we could channel our anger for good, and we can work on spreading change and not violence. It's extremely important to channel our anger in a healthy way and not in a way that hurts those around you. I would say that we are social beings, and we are definitely, like, we influence one another by what we see others do and what we see others say. So essentially, violence breeds violence, but also calm can breed calm, and respect can breed respect. So if we're that person who spreads change and not violence, we're getting one step ahead of the curve. And then finally, the third action that the public can take is accountability of their peers. So just as I mentioned that, like, law enforcement need to police one another, we as a society, we need to do the same. We need to talk to one another. And if we see something happening that could cause harm, we need to hold ourselves and others accountable, which is really important for the lasting changes that we are looking to see. So in a nutshell, and I'm going to get off my soapbox very soon, just bringing these concepts together, we need to work in partnerships to get to a place where everyone wants to be safe and supported. And that takes collaboration between policing, public health, and the public. So now that I chatted a bit about that, we're going to jump into de-escalation, which I absolutely love to chat about. It's my extreme passion. And as many of you know, evidence-based practices are ones that, like, use current scientific evidence in making decisions about kind of how to treat a patient in the medical context, or in our case, how to train an officer. So evidence-based practices for policing is really defined as a research approach that evaluates policies and programs through this scientific analysis to kind of determine what works. So an example is to test training to make sure that it's making a difference in the areas you want to see changed. So for de-escalation training, we want to implement training, but we also want to, like, make sure that the main outcomes that we want to see are being seen. So for example, we want to see decreases in physical force and weapon force and injuries and fatalities and complaints. And this really goes to show that training is making a lasting change if we could prove that these things are happening. And with that being said, there are lots of things that kind of we can look at to make sure if training is evidence-based and what is ineffective and what is effective. So as mentioned previously, it's extremely important to evaluate training, but when evaluating, we need to make sure that we're looking at the right outcomes. So I have on the screen effective evaluation and ineffective evaluation. So I'm going to chat first about the ineffective. So if you look at the right side of the screen, what this could look like is kind of completing training and then proclaiming that by simply completing the training, you've met expectations, kind of regardless of whether training adds or removes value from the officer outcomes. So this could look like saying something like training was successful because, you know what, everyone liked the training, or basing it off of the attitudes towards specific groups. So for example, number one, it says, if we survey members after training and asking them how they felt training went, and finding out, oh, you know what, everyone liked it. It's great that everyone liked it, but that does not mean that is evidence-based and that it is effective and that it made any changes behaviorally. Secondly, police training in mental health and de-escalation and looking at their stigma towards mental illness before and after training. So if we find that stigma decreased, this is not necessarily effective in its entirety either. It is assumed that if stigma goes down, that training is successful. But even though, like, I thought that this was the case until I did some research, and during my PhD, I was lucky, like, to have the EPS, Edmonton Police Service, allow me to assist in creating training for them. So shout out to EPS. I know you're out there. We delivered training to over 600 Edmonton Police Service officers over 19 training days. And after we evaluated it, we looked at behaviors and attitudes towards mental health calls. And we sent out surveys to gauge stigma before and after training. And we actually found that the attitudes towards mental illness and mental health after the training either stayed the same or got worse. So that's right, it got worse. However, we also looked at the behaviors and the more direct measures. And we found that use of physical force went down by 40%, and use of weapon force went down by 26%. And complaints went down by 20%, and confidence went up by 23%. So behaviorally, the training was effective and it worked to get those outcomes that we needed, but the attitudes and the stigma went up. So again, these are opposing ideas. You would think that one would lead to the other, but it's not the case. So we just need to make sure that we're looking at both. If we decide to look at attitudes, we also need to look at behaviors. And then thirdly, the time frame is extremely important when we're doing evaluation. It's important to not just look at changes the same day or one day after. We need to make sure that there is a bit more follow-up, perhaps 3 months or even 6 months after. And then if you look at the other side of things, the effective approaches, so evaluating training by looking at behavioral outcomes is extremely important. I've put out 5 outcome measures or recommendations, but again, every organization might differ in their outcome measures. I've put up use of force and injuries and complaints, just things I've chatted about. Self-report officer behavior, there's research behind how the self-report measures, so an officer filling in a survey is actually a better predictor than a supervisor filling in a survey about their officer. And that's only if the surveys are anonymous as well. So that is one thing to take in mind in terms of self-report measures. And then the communication occurrences and public trust surveys that can help you out to make it more effective as well. If you want more information on this, I did write an article back in 2015, it seems like forever ago now, that kind of takes you through how you can evaluate a training program in de-escalation. And feel free to just search my name and the word loop. It's like the Frontiers database that holds all my articles, or some of them. So if you do that, you'll be able to find it. Some other factors that have been found to be effective for de-escalation training include the use of scenario-based training and in-person training. So in-person training, it's extremely important and valuable. It creates a realistic environment that is intellectually and emotionally stimulating. Now, although there is limited research conducted on police training, kind of comparing lecture training versus live action training, the medical field has done and studied this more extensively. And probably Lisa will also chat about it a bit more because she's done also lots of research in that area. But the medical and policing fields, it's very similar to kind of compare them because they both have two distinct characteristics. They are both life-saving and they both are under these time pressures. So there was a meta-analysis completed that showed that actors and scenarios are effective in training and that having actors are better than lecture training. So better than just having a group of people in a classroom and talking at them. When I held a training session in Toronto, I got a local video crew to come in and film the day. And this is like a sneak peek of my de-escalation training, my evidence-based de-escalation training. And so this is actually a video on the screen, but I know we don't have time. So I have included the link to this video in my Whova profile. So feel free to go to that and view that. So I did have a few quiz questions throughout, but I can see that I am running out of time. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. So an important aspect of experiential training is feedback. So what the question I had was, what is more effective, using actors or police actors? So the answer is actually, it really depends on many other factors. So just understanding that hiring actors itself can be extremely expensive. And because of that, lots of organizations, they have police that are actors and that do that scenario-based role play. And again, the medical field has studied this and finds that although practice with actors results in better performance compared to practice with colleagues, it really depends on how the actors are trained and how good they are at providing feedback to the individual that you are training. So for example, if we have a police actor that is competent in their skills to provide feedback to members, even ones that are older than them, without feeling like they're stepping on their toes, then it's quite all right to hire police actors if, again, they have that confidence and they have those acting skills. But if not, then it's better to hire just actors themselves, just because there's that arm's length relationship. How often should training be refreshed? So training should be refreshed every 1 to 3 years. So time is very valuable and limited, with increasing amounts of training needed in every organization. And it is suggested that training be refreshed at least every 3 years, just because of the evidence behind decrease in memory and skill retention. So the skills tend to go away after 1 year, and then after 3 years, they're completely gone if you've been trained in it. So it's important to refresh every 3 years. And in addition to training being refreshed every 1 to 3 years, there are other evidence-based components of training. Refresher training can be either in person or online. And again, this recommendation has been created with the understanding that time is valuable and limited, with increasing amounts of training needed in every organization. It's important that the length of the refresher be at least 90 to 120 minutes, with a quick break every 20 minutes, just since attention spans are reset every 20 minutes. And if going the online route, just making sure the training is engaging and realistic. Now, I work with an online e-learning company, and I put my training into an online context, and you can find it at protraining.com. And just what's really important about this training is it's realistic. There are scenarios. It's a choose your own adventure. And if you make the incorrect choice, you can see the meter on the side of the screen. It'll go up to show escalation. And if you choose the correct choice, it'll go down to show de-escalation. So it's, again, important that online training is extremely engaging. And finally, the last component I want to talk about is just keeping in mind that, de-escalation training, it needs to be incorporated into all in-person training. Since de-escalation can be used in many contexts, it needs to be incorporated into use of force training and mental health training and recruit training. And I found that in my research and in my work, if we have like a mental health training day or a de-escalation training day, officers are coming in knowing that they're going to have to de-escalate and not believing that they're going to need to use force. And on the other side of things, if you have use of force training, they go in thinking, oh, use of force training, and not, I don't need to incorporate de-escalation training or mental health training, et cetera, et cetera. So if we can incorporate them all as a whole, that would be really great in, I guess, making the training more realistic for the employees. One final thing to note is that there's just a few challenges when it comes to de-escalation training. One, again, is the lack of budget, because to hire actors, it could get really expensive. Secondly, the challenge is that lots of police organizations, they have their own training section. They have their own de-escalation training that they have been delivering for years. Sometimes it's evidence-based, sometimes it's not. Again, it really depends. So it's really important, I guess, to make sure that they have the kind of evidence-based training that they deserve. And then the third thing is that the training is usually one time. There's no continued education or updates. And this is also because there's lots of different trends that come up and things and priorities that organizations need to then train on that priority. And also de-escalation training itself is not mandatory. So taking these all into account, what I've done over the last year is I've actually put together a thing I call the De-escalation Academy. And there are 3 steps. Well, there's 4 steps, as you can see, but there's 3 main steps. The first one is that online course I chatted about. The second one is a 6-hour in-person or live training program virtually because of COVID. And the third is like a webinar type, 2 hours every month training to get that continued education. And then the fourth option is the train the trainer, where I spend 3 days going through the train the trainer program that I've created for organizations. And I teach you kind of the evidence and also the training itself and how to deliver it to your organization. So I have included a form. There's a link on my Whova profile. If you're interested in finding out more about this, message me, or as well as click that link and fill in the form, and I'll get back to you within the next couple of weeks. So basically, in summary, de-escalation training, it is a piece of the solution. Evidence-based training and evidence-informed components, they are crucial for lasting changes. And finally, continued training is necessary. We need to make sure that the officers not only get the training that they deserve, but also it's constantly refreshed and updated along the way. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or again, to fill out that form on my Whova profile. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carmodines. That was a very interesting presentation. It was a very, very systematic look at the idea of evidence-based practice, as well as how that practice applies to de-escalation. If we have time for questions, I'm sure there'll be some in the audience. So at this point, without further ado, we'll go to Constable DeVoe. Is that the right title? So for many years, serving as a constable in the Ottawa Police Department. Is that, yeah, you know, I always, come on, I'm a native New Yorker and a guy from the States. I want to get my titles right. So, but also a registered social worker who, in order to just learn more about effective de-escalation and effective interventions, and as I said in the intro, resolve some of the tensions between use of force training, de-escalation training, crisis intervention training, is now doing a practicum, right, where you're dealing with patients in a clinical setting. So we'd love to hear about your work. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Yeah, so I have been a police constable with the Ottawa Police for 5 years. And as Brandon mentioned, I took a leave of absence in February to work full-time in the hospital. So before I was working part-time, I was doing policing, and I was working in the hospital in the emergency department alongside psychiatrists dealing with people in crisis. And now I'm working in dementia unit just to develop my skills as a social worker. So this is my first time presenting at this conference and even being at this conference. So I did pre-record a video because I just know I'm under a time constraint and I have a lot to say on this topic, so I probably will go over, so I pre-recorded it. And Yasmin's focused more on evidence-based training, and mine is focusing on the contradictions within policing and the emphasis on force and how we as officers are trained to use force and how this causes issues for us from the public, and just the need to have mandatory de-escalation training because it is not mandated, as you were going to see. And most of my research focuses in Canada, and specifically within Ontario, just because of I was under time constraints. It was a 4-month course, and I would love to continue my research, but we'll see where that goes. So I will start to share this screen. I'm not good with technology, so.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about de-escalation, mental health, and policing, as this is something I'm very passionate about. My name is Lisa DeVoe, and I'm a police constable for the Ottawa Police Service. Police officers are constantly scrutinized for using too much force and not enough de-escalation. And this is an issue that dates back to many years, if not since the onset of policing. So while I was completing my master's of social work, I decided to create a course that looked at de-escalation, crisis intervention, and mental health training for officers. I had one of my professors agree to supervise me on this topic, Dr. Susan Bradley, and throughout this course, I was really interested in learning how many hours each service dedicated to teaching officers de-escalation skills. I reviewed literature and I contacted police services directly, both within Canada and in the United States, although I will highlight that most of my research is within Ontario just due to time constraints. But I did speak to some national and international organizations, and I did actually have more of a response from police services within the United States and organizations within the United States. But I really learned a lot about de-escalation, crisis intervention training, and how it is mandated for officers. And I also discovered promising approaches and responses to mental health crises. So as I said, I was hired by the Ottawa Police Service roughly 5 years ago, and I really just want to highlight that I worked alongside many officers who were very effective in de-escalating, and they showed patience, compassion, and empathy, and I really learned a lot from my colleagues. But what I want to focus on here today is more of a systemic issue with police training. I noticed as an officer that during my annual mandatory training, the skills that were taught to myself and my colleagues were not the skills we needed when responding to a lot of the calls for service, especially when it had a mental health component. And this seemed like a contradiction to me. So I decided to go back to school to pursue a master's of social work at Carleton University. And while I was attempting to improve my therapeutic skills, I had actually enrolled in a structural school of social work. So this particular program focused more on systemic issues within society that maintain the status quo and that disadvantage marginalized communities. And I ended up applying this lens to law enforcement. And throughout all of my research, I came to three main points, which I will discuss in detail. My main points are that Canadian police forces value and prioritize use of force, which can be seen in the way services recruit, train, and promote officers. And this ultimately stems from Canadian colonial roots. And my second argument is that because law enforcement values force, it takes priority over de-escalation training, and it explains why there is a lack of it. And lastly, and most importantly, this is a systemic issue that has been perpetuated by governmental bodies. To expand on my first argument, I'm going to briefly discuss the history of policing in Canada. And I just want to acknowledge that this is an uncomfortable and sensitive topic to discuss. However, it is important to understand how policing has evolved within Canada and how the profession continues to have colonial roots. Policing in Canada began as a means to forcefully protect land that was conquered and stolen from Aboriginal communities by European settlers. In order to protect the land, Europeans established the Northwest Mounted Police, and this was a militarized force that only recruited those who had a military background. And those officers really attempted to abolish Indigenous culture and Indigenous independence, and they really tried to assimilate Aboriginal people into European culture. And they did this by using force, having weapons, and just having an intimidating presence. I believe we can still feel the impacts of this historical approach and how police services recruit, train, and promote officers. Today, the culture of policing continues to value this paramilitary enforcement model over de-escalation. Policing, in general, sees no issue in dedicating hours of training towards officers' weapons, such as the taser, OC spray, baton strikes, and batons, and firearms. Yet the same time, research, and money is not spent or used towards de-escalation and mental health training. However, this approach and this emphasis on force is completely incongruent with what the research tells us, and it is obvious that research is not used to inform police practices. If we look at the research in 2015, according to Public Safety Canada, 98% of the calls for service require de-escalation and communication skills to resolve the issue. So there was no need to use force. Only 2% of the calls required the use of force. And again, if we look at police-involved fatalities, which is another study that was conducted within Canada, most fatal encounters involve a person who is experiencing a mental health crisis or is also under the influence of drugs and or alcohol. And these are really important statistics that should not only inform services on how they train officers, but it should also highlight the need for a mental health unit that is appropriately staffed and has adequate resources. However, if we were to look at specialized units within police forces, we can see the implicit biases and the priorities of these services. It is common to see large tactical units and smaller mental health units, or for services to not even have a mental health unit. I will use the Ottawa Police Service as an example, only because I work with Ottawa Police, so I'm familiar with the service, but I am certain that this is not unique to Ottawa. I would imagine that most services have the same structure. So within Ottawa, the tactical unit has 29 officers and the mental health unit has 9 officers. And the criteria to get into the tactical unit compared to the mental health unit is quite different. The tactical unit, or militarized units, requires candidates to go through months of extensive training and vetting where officers need to prove themselves before they are possibly given entry into the unit. The selection process for the mental health unit does not follow the same rigorous requirements. Promotions are not offered to the best candidate, but rather officers who have put their time in. They do not look or consider an officer's credentials, their education, and experience when staffing units other than the tactical unit. And I wonder what kind of message this sends the public when services put so much energy and time into staffing more militarized units, and then they do not require the same rigorous process for other units, such as the mental health unit. And I find this interesting, especially when the research tells us that most fatal encounters by police occur when the person is experiencing a mental health crisis. So this really all ties into my second point, which is the lack of de-escalation training for officers, because there is this emphasis on force. When I approached my research, my main questions were, are officers trained to de-escalate? How many hours are services mandated to train officers on de-escalation, crisis intervention, and mental health? And how effective is this training? I used 2 approaches to researching this question, a literature review and an environmental scan. The journals I reviewed really discussed de-escalation, mental health, and policing within Canada and the United States. The research mainly focused on 2 approaches to de-escalation and crisis response, and which were the crisis intervention training and mobile crisis team. So this is a very brief overview of crisis intervention training, but essentially it was a course that was developed in the States, and it's a week-long 40-hour course that certifies officers in crisis intervention skills and the ability to respond to mental health crises. And this course really discusses symptoms of mental illnesses, de-escalation skills, and mental health resources, where the mobile crisis team is a partnership between mental health professionals and police. So a mental health professional is paired with an officer, and together they respond to mental health emergencies, so 911 emergencies. And the mobile crisis team has different names depending on the service you're speaking to. So you may hear it be called Impact Team, the Mobile Rapid Crisis mobile crisis rapid response team, but it's essentially pairing a mental health professional with a police officer, and together you respond to 911 emergencies. So and while they could be very effective in de-escalating the person on scene, I think the research could have went a little bit further to explore those skills and ask citizens their experiences with mental health professionals compared to officers, what skills they preferred to see, and why they preferred speaking with a mental health professional. I also found the research really didn't provide an intersectional lens. The research really didn't consider how the uniform influences the interaction before it's even begun. For example, marginalized communities, Black, Indigenous people of color, BIPOC communities, have a lot of mistrust with police due to the history of policing and being targeted. The research does not adequately account for this and how this affects the interaction. Further, I found that the research did not really consider an officer's credentials and whether that influences the interaction. So I was curious if an officer had a dual designation, if they were a registered social worker or a registered nurse and they were also a police officer, if this influenced the interaction. And I think that can have potential implications for how services recruit officers and staff units. Overall, I would say the research showed the mobile crisis team to be more effective in dealing with mental health crises than officers who were trained and certified crisis intervention officers. The mobile crisis team was more likely to reduce on-scene times, reduce hospitalization, and reduce wait times at the hospital. And when the research asked citizens' perspective, citizens did report preferring to speak with a mental health professional over an officer when in crisis. And so I think this just highlights the importance of not only having officers trained in de-escalation, but also having that partnership with mental health professionals. And I think the reason that mental health professionals, the mobile crisis team, is so effective in responding to mental health emergencies is, of course, because they have completed the education, so they are a mental health professional. Second of all, I think that they also have the ability to be a part of the circle of care, which is something that police officers do not have that privilege. So within the Personal Health Information Protection Act within Ontario, I can speak to another regulated healthcare professional about a patient in order to best treat that person. So if I'm dealing with a person in crisis, I'm able to see if they are connected with a social worker, if they are connected to a psychiatrist, and I'm able to get the background story and to, maybe reconnect them to that person if need be. And lastly, I think that as a mental health professional, you have the ability to put in referrals, which again, police officers don't have the ability. So if I am responding to a 911 crisis, someone's dealing with a mental health crisis, but it's not necessarily to the point where I need to bring them to the emergency room, I can make referrals to psychiatric outreach clinics, and so they don't necessarily have to be apprehended and brought to the hospital at that time. When I was reading the literature, I noticed that there was nothing that discussed how many hours each service dedicated to de-escalation training and that had a mental health component. So I conducted an environmental scan. I contacted police services directly, and I focused in on Ontario again just because of the time constraints that I was under. But I asked how many hours they dedicated to de-escalation and mental health training and whether they had any means of evaluating this. And I also asked what approach or model they used in responding to mental health emergencies. And I'm not going to disclose the specific information about each service, but what I did notice was there was no consistency within Ontario. So some services can spend 5 days on mental health and de-escalation training, and some services don't have a course at all. So, and it didn't matter the size of the service. There was no correlation between the size of the service and the number of days they spent on de-escalation and mental health training. And these courses are optional as well. It is not mandatory for police officers to take this training. So not every police officer has this training. And I also noticed that the way in which services responded to mental health crises varied as well. So some services would have a team, so they would have the mobile crisis team or some variation of that, and they would have mental health professionals paired with officers responding to 911 emergencies. But then again, some services didn't have a team and they relied on frontline officers who are probably not well equipped in responding to those calls. And then some services, instead of having a mobile crisis team that responded to in-progress emergencies, they have what was called a COAS team. And this team did more follow-up to 911 emergencies. So they would go in a few days after the 911 emergency and make sure that person is connected to mental health resources within the community. So making sure that they are still using those resources. But it's important to note that, as I said, not every officer has mental health training. So officers who are in the COAS team may not even have de-escalation or mental health training, yet they are acting as a mental health professional within the police service. So because I recognized that there was so much discretion in how police services train and how they respond to mental health crises, I ended up contacting researchers and professors, both nationally and internationally. And these are some of the organizations that I spoke with. And I was just wanted to find out again more about mandatory training for police services and how it's mandated. So what I found was that both within the United States and Canada, they do not mandate de-escalation training for police services. It is left up to the individual service to decide how much time and effort they put into de-escalation and mental health training. Further, the approach these services use is also left up to them. So that's why we can see some services who use the mobile crisis team and some services who don't have a mobile crisis team. And most of the researchers confirm that there isn't a lot of information or there isn't a lot of research on evaluating these approaches to de-escalation, crisis intervention, and mental health. This brings me to my final point, which is that this continued emphasis on use of force is a systemic issue that has been perpetuated by governmental bodies. As previously explained, when I completed this course, due to time constraints, I only focused in on Ontario. So I only really looked at the Ontario Ministry of the Solicitor General and how they mandate police training in Ontario. The ministry oversees policing in Ontario, and they require services to meet minimum training requirements, and we can find this breakdown in the Policing Standards Manual. And so I was able to get an understanding of the annual training requirements imposed on police services for taser, baton, OC spray, firearms, combat training. As you can see, I found specific time requirements for use of force training, and I also found that the Policing Standards Manual placed a lot of emphasis on tactical skills or forceful skills. It discussed soft hand techniques, hard hand techniques, and tactical communication. But I did not find any minimum time requirements for de-escalation communication and mental health training. Although it is clear within the Policing Standards Manual that communication is encouraged, as well as de-escalation, I found it interesting that there was no set time allocated to teaching it. And I know that the ministry implemented a new enhanced de-escalation training standard throughout Ontario that was supposed to be implemented the summer of 2018. However, when I was conducting my environmental scan, I was unable to find further information about this. So I don't know where it's at. I don't know how it's been rolled out and how it's been evaluated. Ultimately, what I noted is there seems to be a disconnect in how the ministry mandates police training and the actual duties of a police officer. It makes me consider whether the ministry uses research to inform officer training. and how they evaluate this training, especially given how discretionary de-escalation and mental health training is within Canada. And I do find that police services can be reluctant to work with and collaborate with researchers, and I just wonder why, again, the ministry hasn't mandated or required services to disclose certain information. Given that officers are trained to use force, they're trained to be efficient with their weapons at the expense of de-escalation training, it makes sense that officers would resort to their weapons when responding to calls and being confronted on calls. But this approach seems to surprise everybody, including those who mandate this training. And I do find that services are meeting those minimum mandatory training requirements that are being imposed on them. And I do find there are, a number of officers who are effective in analyzing a situation, using those critical thinking skills, and applying the skills that they have been taught. So I feel that if they were given the opportunity to learn de-escalation and mental health skills, they would just be that much more effective in applying those skills to a lot of the calls that they are responding to. In conclusion, I
Thank
would
you
say
very much, Lisa.
we don't have enough research to know how.
Hey, thank you. I'm sorry that we cut you
No,
off. I
that's
saw
okay.
that you were on your last slide, and we just wanted to have some concluding remarks because they have to get the next panel set up. But I thought that was a wonderful symbiosis of presentations, right? We had one that looked at the basis of scientific study of practice in general, and then of a well-vetted research-supported intervention into de-escalation that could be given out on the internet if need be to a wide range of police officers. And then that was from Dr. Cramadine, and then Constable DeVoe comes in to talk about down in the trenches, the experiences of police officers responding as crisis interventionists, as mobile crisis teams, as rank and file police officers, and how the policies and the training really are at odds with the expectations. We only have about a minute or two, but I'd love to know if there's maybe one or possibly two questions out in the audience. I know some folks said that the general police in Ontario would like to hear more about this, Lisa. So, and I'm sure they'd love your platform, Yasmin. If anyone has any questions out there in the chat box or the Q&A, we can take them. I think we have like 1 or 2 minutes, and then we might need to back off and give this space to the next group of presenters. No. So I guess I had one question then to close for Yasmin. So there was a study that was done by the IACP in the US about ICAT, PERFs, de-escalation training. They evaluated it in, I forget where, I'll remember in a moment, but they were using a stepwise randomized control trial. So you said you had the only vetted evidence-based de-escalation. Is there room for two in that measure now, or
Yeah,
do you have it?
definitely.
Yeah, great.
I've heard of ICAT. When I heard of ICAT, I read about it, and it was just people's, I guess, views. They brought experts together into a room and they created a training. And that's what I heard of it, but it sounds like that they've done more research on it. So that's awesome to hear that they've done that. I'll have to look.
Yeah, no, it's interestingly right. It was almost the Delphi model of an expert consensus when they developed the training, but then they did use a stepwise randomized control trial to look at the effects and found less use of force and fewer injuries for police and subjects. But it's different than yours. Yours is more rank and file patrol oriented. That's more crisis oriented. Somebody with a knife, somebody with a bat. We have already reached a certain level. And I don't know if you had any concluding remarks, Lisa, but I think you did a great job of highlighting the fundamental tension between the training requirements and the practice requirements that exist now in policing.
Yeah, I would love to continue my research and look at all of Canada, because my research really focused only on Ontario. I'm looking at how they train officers in de-escalation. So I think that would just be something that I'm still really interested in, because I'm sure that it is across Canada, and it's important to note that it is how we are mandated. We are mandated to use force, and that's how we're trained.
No, thank you. I guess we can close by saying, I thought your approaches were really quite complementary to each other, your research approaches. I think when you put them together and consider them as a whole, they make the case for real good evidence-informed training about de-escalation. So Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful panel.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, if that's it, if there are no more questions, folks, then we'll go and we'll turn this space over to the next group that's going to set up. Have a great conference.
You as
Take care.
well. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Mhm.